Good afternoon, everyone. I know the keynote went a little late, so I apologize for us starting a few minutes late, but I will go ahead and I will hand it over to our presenter.
Thank you, Ms. Martell. Good afternoon, all. My name is Dr. Jacqueline Bailey Davis, Staff Inspector with the Philadelphia Police Department. Today, I would like to provide you with some insight on law enforcement and victim service providers, a collaborative governance approach to assisting victims. Shall I start now?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, sorry about that. Once again, I am Dr. Jacqueline Bailey Davis, Staff Inspector with the Philadelphia Police Department. Today, I would like to provide you with some insight on law enforcement and victim service providers, a collaborative governance approach to assisting victims. The contents within this presentation are my viewpoints and suggestions for law enforcement and victim service providers seeking to work together to provide comprehensive services to victims, as well as working to build trust and legitimacy. The collaborative governance approach is a process that is not one that is overnight, but a process that deals with longevity. Next slide, please. Overview. I will discuss the following throughout this presentation, which are definitions, considerations for law enforcement and victim service providers collaborating, impediments to law enforcement, victim service providers, and victims collaborating, how to combat impediments to collaborating, how to address victims' issues, collaborative governance approach, the 215 Village, the 215 Village events and initiatives, evaluation of efforts and outcomes, collaborate, meaning an acronym, as well as closing remarks and contact information. Next slide, please. Definitions. Throughout this program or presentation, I will discuss law enforcement, which I'm referring to local, state, and federal officers who are agents of the government and are responsible for enforcing laws. Victim service providers, I'm referring to individuals, groups, and organizations, both public and private, who provide services to victims at the local, state, and federal levels. Also, when I speak about victims, it's twofold. I'm speaking about a person or persons who have suffered a physical and or emotional harm, property damage, or economic loss as a result of a crime. These persons are either directly or indirectly impacted by crime. Last, collaborative governance, I'm referring to multiple sectors, i.e. the government, community, and private entities working together to resolve issues that cannot be resolved independently. When I speak about collaborative governance, that term, most political science and or public administration scholars have utilized the work and conducted research on the collaborative governance approach. In particular, one most famous for this term is Robert Agranoff. Next slide. Considerations for law enforcement and victim service providers collaborating. Number one, law enforcement and victim service providers have a fiduciary role to protect and serve victims. As public servants, we are to provide protection and service, and that should be a part of our core of our mission. Number two, humanity and sanctity of life should be a priority when we are assisting victims, because the initial encounters with victims and throughout this process, it is critical to show humanity and sanctity of life as a priority to help with the recovery of the victim. Number three, familiarization with laws, resources, and respective policies, procedures, and protocols of both the law enforcement and victim service provider. When you're able to do this, have that familiarization, the victim feels more at ease with both entities, and that helps to show the display of competence and care on the part of the law enforcement and victim service providers. Number four, collaborating to provide comprehensive services. This collaborations allow for law enforcement and victim service providers to address gaps in services. Sometimes if you're working as in silos, you may not see the issues that you're having with not getting the full services to the victims. So therefore, if you're working with other organizations or other entities, you're able to recognize through other lenses that you're having these gaps in services. Number 5, taking action to mitigate harm. You have to be cognizant of nonverbal and, of course, verbal communications when serving victims. You want to make sure that you avoid judgment of the victim's circumstances. As well as when you mitigate the harm, you want to make sure that all of the services that you need to render to that individual, that they understand that you are committed to helping them to heal. Number 6, use of the ABC model as a framework to address victims' needs. This ABC model is my personal model that I use to address any and all issues personally and professionally, but in particular, I use them for addressing social issues and beyond. So the A is authentic discourse and engagement, the B is behavior modifications, and the C is collaborative governance approach, which I will talk about a little more in depth a little later. Number 7, commitment to collaborating. The commitment and consistency are needed for the collaboration to have longevity. There are other factors and other components, but there must be commitment and consistency by both parties. Next slide, please. Impediments to law enforcement, victim service providers, and victims collaborating. Number 1 is the lack of trust. We know that victims and victim service providers often have a lack of trust of police, either due to previous encounters with police or negative narratives about police and or their service or the lack thereof. The police, however, also have trust issues with victims, i.e. domestic violence calls, because we know statistically that an officer's safety is more threatened when they're answering such calls as domestic violence calls. Number 2, preconceived notions and biases. Here there's a belief that police further victimize victims, that they don't help the victims as per encounters or oral accounts from victims or victim service providers. These victim service providers and sometimes the victims develop a disdain for law enforcement because of the perception or the actual lack of service in their eyes. Based upon police action and inaction, these biases are formed, and of course there's the distrust. Number 3, research and statistical findings. This is very helpful because there are several studies that talks about quantitative methods and findings on victims and victim service providers, saying that there are gaps in services or that the law enforcement institutions or agencies, if you will, are not providing the necessary services needed or the deficiencies of the services in the services. So I believe that we should have more qualitative studies, which gives oral accounts directly from the victims about the deficiencies, whether they're in law enforcement or the victim services. And so there's more insight to correct the issues when you hear the oral accounts of the victims. Number 4, the blame game. Victim service providers and victims often blame law enforcement officers for a lack of protection. Just yesterday or this morning, I heard on the news that in Philadelphia, there are victims, family members, and witnesses who are coming forth, and they feel like their lives have been threatened and they don't have the protection, whether it's from police or the district attorney's office or any other law enforcement entity that protects them. So here you have this blame game where the law enforcement officers or entities may blame either the legislative and or judicial systems for weak policies and or a lack of consequences of offenders who are engaged in such criminal acts. Number 5, a lack of resources. The lack of resources usually comes from having issues with funding, money, also a lack of personnel or the inability to retain personnel, also, or to recruit personnel, and also that the programs may be phenomenal programs, but they are limited in what they can do. Number 6, inconsistencies. So these inconsistencies between law enforcement and victim service providers, this information with regard to these inconsistencies may confuse the victim. may delay the services and care of the victim and the resources as well. And this can actually add to the victim's stress levels or trauma. So the inconsistencies between law enforcement and victim service providers also hampers the partnerships and collaborative governance process between the two. Next slide, please. How to combat impediments to collaborating? Well, to combat lack of trust, you should have non-enforcement encounters. So law enforcement and victim service providers should engage in proactive non-enforcement encounters to help victims even before they become victims. And this collaboration of non-enforcement encounters being proactive can be taking place during community outreach, where you have resource events, different initiatives to address the multitude of issues that we're facing in our communities, as well as just simply information sessions to provide people with information about various issues and where they can get their support services. Number two, combating preconceived notions and biases with self-assessments. I believe it's imperative for us all to just sit back, take a breath, and identify our own biases, whether it's about victims, law enforcement, or victim service providers. And I believe that the use of the non-enforcement encounters, such as these events, these community outreach initiatives, could be used as icebreakers to have an opportunity for all parties involved to authentically engage. And this can actually help dispel some of those biases or bad feelings about any of those entities. Number three, you can combat the negative research findings with reviewing your agency's work. I believe that if there are findings that tells you as a law enforcement agency or a victim service provider agency that said findings says here are the deficiencies within those entities. So you look at your organization and you ascertain whether or not through evaluation and assessment, if in fact those deficiencies are they occurring within your agency. And if so, I would suggest that law enforcement entities, as well as victim service providers, you can use your public relations or media relations or your public information officer, whomever's in charge of your websites, your social media outlets, as well as your public service announcements. With regard to the website, let's say of a police department, I think it's imperative that right from the gate, as soon as someone logs into a police website, they should be able to find an icon on the first page that deals with helping victims. I think it's frustrating for a victim to have to fish through multiple icons to get to the icon that provides them with the services that they need. And I don't believe that a primary focus should just be on crime, capturing criminals. So you kind of have the victims feeling left out or not important. Number four, you can combat the blame game with accountability. You have to make sure that when it comes to your own agency, that you're doing your part before you criticize. I often say that if you're willing to criticize, you should be willing to work on correcting some behaviors. So you need to hold yourself and your organization responsible for any of the errors and or the poor services that may be given from your own agency before we start to reach out and talk about other agencies. Number five, you can combat a lack of resources with being creative. If you have a shortage of personnel, let's say in a law enforcement agency, there are officers who are retired who may want to come back and be trained volunteers to help you out. And I'll talk about that in 1 second. So also you want to work on trying to streamline some of your services so that you can have fewer errors as well as delays in services. And number six, to combat inconsistencies, you can do so with being process driven. Quite oftentimes, the inconsistencies come about is because we did one thing one day and then we didn't do it the next. If we actually sit down with our collaborative team and we have an understanding of the victim's needs and what needs to be done, we can actually draft up a process so that it's organized and that it's complete. And I understand that there are times where things have to not occur in a chronology of a fashion, a sequential fashion, excuse me. excuse me, but you need to have some processes in place. Next slide, please. How to address victims' issues. What should be done first when addressing these issues? My go-to is my ABC model, which should be used as a framework to addressing these issues. So the first things first, before you can address the issues, there has to be an opportunity for authentic discourse and engagement. The victim service provider, and law enforcement officers should be able to, one, speak freely and openly without fear of repercussion and or without fear of this total severing of ties between police, victim service providers, the community at large. Also, this authentic discourse, there has to be real and honest discourse regarding the issues, because if you can't be honest and real about the issues, you cannot find the right solutions. Also, behavior modifications. These truthful discussions allows for all parties to recognize behaviors that they're engaging in that are possibly harmful or pernicious, and therefore working on how to modify those harmful behaviors to become helpful. And also, with the collaborative governance approach, you have to work together to achieve goals. You may have to create some benchmarks for all parties to meet when assisting these victims. So also, I want to give an example about the opportunity to hear from victims, as well as law enforcement entities. I find that I find myself listening to city council hearings. So this particular day, I was listening to a city council hearing because we've been having a lot based on gun violence. And of course, gun violence is running rampant in all cities throughout the US, but in particular in Philadelphia. And I heard a victim who's the victim family member of a deceased individual say that they had an issue with the Philadelphia Police Department's homicide division, where something as simple as not calling back the victim's family member, the next of kin. And I feel like after a city council hearing meeting, something is a person saying they don't think the officers care, they're not returning their calls, the detectives are not returning their calls. I think that the public administration officer or media relations person should automatically, after the council hearings, should do a summary video to let all individuals within that police department know the feelings of the community members and how we're going to incorporate or streamline processes. So this is where you could say, listen, I work on a floor above the homicide detectives. And when I see these detectives, I know they're burned out. They have an extremely high caseload and they're running back and forth from job to job, not getting any sleep. I'm watching these men and women and other wolf down food at a table to only run back out on another job. So here's how we can address the issue so that these family members who've been impacted by homicides can feel important and relevant and that they matter. You can have the use of those trained retired officers or just a volunteer make the return calls. If there's no pertinent information, they can make the calls just to let them know that whether it's a case that happened yesterday or 2 years ago, that the Philadelphia Police Department has not forgotten about them and they're still doing their best. I think we can alleviate some of the tensions from adding those extra layers of help from those individuals. Next slide, please. Collaborative governance approach. You may say to yourself, how do I go about this collaborative governance approach? Well, one, I believe that law enforcement and victim service providers should have a designated liaison. So whether you're a law enforcement victim service provider, this particular liaison is responsible for ensuring continuity between multiple parties, especially when we're ensuring that communication is accurate, information is understood and is also accurate. And you can do this also in a form of a video. Also, number two, the law enforcement liaison should identify this collaborative team, meaning the participants. You have to identify the participants who are going to be a part of this collaborative governance process. So for the police department, you may have crisis intervention team officers, you may have radio dispatchers involved, you may have victim services staff, community relations officers, and also the victim service providers all have to come together to help build this collaboration. Number 3, law enforcement liaison conducts a search to find victim service provider agencies who are willing to collaborate. This is a very important step because guess what? Not everyone wants to collaborate with law enforcement. So you have to make sure that those who are joining you really want to be in this process. And I would say to you that people who are skeptical or have a level of trepidation about connecting and collaborating with the police, when they see other entities working with you, they come on board. Number 4, law enforcement agencies, liaisons need to send correspondence to meet and greet and collaborate. This is an important step because this is an opportunity that when you do meet to flesh out details about the collaboration, about the boundaries and other pertinent information. Number 5, the meet and greet to discuss the ABC model and commitment to collaboration. The ABC model must be used as a framework to address issues and help law enforcement and victim service providers become familiar with each other and their processes. Number 6 is one of my favorites. This one pager consisting of all victim service provider agencies who are in the collaborative team. This is great for information sharing. It also helps when current agencies are at capacity. So if you're a law enforcement officer and you come into contact with a victim and you want to give that victim some information to contact a particular victim service provider, there are times where you could actually make the call to see if they're at capacity. And if so, then you can move on to another agency. This prevents the victim from bouncing around from place to place to place to place to place and feel like they're just being, given the runaround or treated like a rag doll. Also, number 7, finalizing that collaborative team list. So after you've had several meetings, there should be some form of articulation agreement that everyone agrees with the collaboration and that they're committed to this collaboration. Next slide, please. Collaborative governance approach continued. Number 8, law enforcement and victim service providers, informational interviewing sessions. Understand at any time, anyone can become a victim. Law enforcement and victim service providers should visit with each other's respective organizations or entities. And the reason being is because you should have some understanding of the work, the responsibilities, and the duties. Another added bonus to this informational interviewing session could be a recruitment initiative. So you may have that victim service provider who's provided maybe 15, 20 years of service, and they're looking to change careers or change directions. They can join the police department, and maybe that police officer who has 30 years of service who wants to retire from law enforcement but still work, and maybe they can go into the victim service providers agencies that they've worked with, and they can actually provide a better understanding of those victim service providers workers who've never worked in law enforcement. So that's actually a win-win situation. Number 9, law enforcement and victim service providers checklists. There should be a checklist to ensure that victims are fully served. Victim service providers should inform victims about the services that they're entitled to, as well as law enforcement personnel should do the same as well. And so when you have a situation, for example, let's say a domestic violence incident, when law enforcement officers arrive on scene, they take the report, they may have to transport the victim. The victim is entitled to a free incident report. The victim does not have to pay for that report. If the victim is seen and then released, or seen and then they go home or go somewhere else, and they don't wait around for that actual report, I think one of the things that you can build on that trust and legitimacy is maybe that officer could swing past that location of the victim and provide him, her, or other with a copy of the report to prevent him, her, or other from going back to the police station to get a copy of the report for court purposes. Law enforcement and victim service providers, non-enforcement encounters, number 10. These encounters are critical, they're imperative because they serve as the glue. the glue to building and keeping that trust, building on that legitimacy. It helps with showing some transparency as well as some accountability. Number 11, evaluation of collaborative work. Now, the work that you're doing, you have to evaluate what works and what does not work. And if you have recommendations from wherever, whether it's the Department of Justice or any other entity or something that you all in your department decide you want to do, you have to understand if something's not working, is it really the recommendation or is it not being implemented properly? So that's important. Number 12, use of the 215 village concept as a template to build your collaborative team. So this collaborative process is so important because it avoids burnout. You think about the issues of gun violence. If you all really think that the law enforcement community alone, meaning police, can solve this problem by themselves, I think you're living in a fairy tale or some sort of magical land, because it's not going to happen. We all need each other. All criminal justice entities, along with victim service providers, nonprofit, for-profit, NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and the community at large. So the 215 Village serves as a primary structure to address multiple issues. Next slide, please. You may say or think it is difficult for law enforcement and victim service providers to collaborate based upon sometimes the negative narrative or past experiences or some of the sensationalism of the events that have been occurring regarding police incidents with individuals engaged in alleged criminal activity or just in any entity. So these non-enforcement encounters help to dispel some of the bad feelings. So I decided, as I work in organizational services, special projects, I decided as a special project to work on the 215 as a concept by which action-oriented individuals, groups, organizations, and business leaders who either live, work, and or support Philadelphia, that these individuals and groups and folks are willing to offer resources and assistance to address social issues and beyond. The 215 model and concept actually came about in around March of 2020, actually June of 2020. The concept of building a village was to utilize everyone in the community to provide support and be a support services. So the significance of the 215 Village is to use this as a prerequisite to establishing a collaborative team. So if you don't feel comfortable just reaching out to other organizations or entities, you can use these non-enforcement encounters that you actually become proactive about and have a community outreach, and then you can actually go to locations where these victim service providers are. So the 215 Village concept allows for law enforcement and victim service providers to address prevention efforts. Also, collaborative teams, they can work together to proactively and reactively assist others. So here you have law enforcement and victim service providers. They are visible, and they are working in the community. They're working together for the betterment of the community and victims as a whole. And working together in this type of setting can actually quell some of the criticism, as well as quell some of the negative narrative that police are not working or they're not doing enough. Next slide, please. Here I'm going to talk about some of the non-enforcement encounters, initiatives, and events of the 215 Village. So this one event was a sneaker giveaway. And actually, this is where in June of 2020, I believe, yes, June of 2020, this was actually an event where we had an external partner, Mr. Andre McDonald from It's From the Soul. It's a nonprofit organization out of New York. He wanted to donate about 300 to 400 pairs of brand new sneakers to Philadelphians to show us some love in our time of need. Mr. McDonald connected with Mike Henson from the organization Self, which is a homeless organization, as well as nonprofit organizations Parent Power and the Earths. We also connected with the William Wade Community Center, as well as the police department. We had 2 one-hour Zoom sessions, and we organized the entire event very well So we had approximately 300 to 400 attendees and not one issue. So police role in this particular event was twofold. We had police officers and transit officers secure the perimeters as well as subway stations to make sure that no one got robbed of their new sneakers. And we also had police personnel on the inside of this event actually helping to provide a professional shoe experience. One of the things I love about this village concept that it shows that in the 21st Century Policing Task Force, Presidential Task Force, that recommends police and community have non-enforcement encounters to build trust and legitimacy, I would concur with those findings. Next slide, please. So the actual first official kickoff for the 215 event came on June 12th at a health and wealth seminar workshop. So I had my friend and classmate, Dr. Nia Bailey. She is a radiation therapist at Christiana Care Oncology Center in Delaware. And she did a presentation about awareness and information and education on triple negative breast cancer. And her employer supported her. She came with free information bags and some goodies about triple negative breast cancer. With the support of my supervisor, I was able to provide a presentation about the 215 Village, the model, the concept, as well as financial security and financial freedom. And we had a great time. Everyone had an opportunity to connect. We had surveys, and I'll talk about that in 1 second. So here are just a few slides that you see that in the end, we all came together, took photographs, and we had a really good time. And folks did, based on the surveys, provided some feedback that was very helpful for us. Next slide, please. Another initiative I thought was important was an initiative called Stop the Bleed. We know that in Philadelphia in 2020, we had approximately 499 homicides. Yeah, I thought the Stop the Bleed initiative could be a great way to educate the community on how to identify life-threatening bleeding, how to pack wounds, how to utilize tourniquets. So my unit actually purchased tourniquets, and we actually had a volunteer by the name of Nurse Tammy Lewis, who's an awesome nurse at Penn Presbyterian Hospital. She came, she had all of her hands-on tools she needed to show people how to stop the bleed. And it was a phenomenal event. We all joined us, Dr. Tina Figueroa from Baltimore, Maryland. Dr. Figueroa is an educator as well as she is a children's author of 2 books. And she actually brought with her about 50 copies of her book, The Magical Necklace and Uncle Mac's Barbershop, which deals with bullying. And she actually autographed all of the books and gave them free of charge to all of the attendees for their children or grandchildren. Next slide, please. Wow, this one's tough. So the 215 Village is just not about attending events or sessions or initiatives, but it's about daily encounters with persons in the community. And I believe with this 215 concept, you have to have the mindset of always wanting to make sure that everyone is okay in the village, okay? So you must be intentional about your serving and serving others. So one day I was at work in police headquarters at what we call the Roundhouse. I was exiting the building, and my aide and I observed this young woman. Her name is Miss Martin. She's in the photograph here. She gave me permission to use her story in this presentation. So Miss Martin was actually standing with her sister-in-law to be, and I asked her, was she okay? And she said she was fine. She was visibly pregnant. She was about 4 or 5 months pregnant, and she told me at the time I didn't know her fiance had been assaulted, and that assault resulted in his death. So she said she was waiting on a detective. She met with a detective. But before then, I gave her my business card, and I said, if you need something, contact me or my aide, and my unit will see what we can do for you. So about a week later, she did in fact contact me. I spoke with her. I asked her how did she feel about the services that she received, and she said everything was great, that the homicide detectives and the victim assistance officer in the unit was great, and she had a couple more questions, so I reached out to them for her, and we all got her the additional services that she needed, plus some additional assistance from PCCD. So thank you, Diane Morgan, Attorney Morgan. Also, after meeting with her and talking with her, I asked if it was okay if I would come and visit her and to give her a gift, just a care package for some books for her unborn child and her son. And I spoke with her for about an hour and said, listen, we'll keep in contact. If you need anything, contact us because we're here for you. I don't know what you're going through. I couldn't imagine, you know, having a 2-year-old and also having an unborn child and losing my fiance. I couldn't imagine that. So needless to say, I still have contact with her at least once a month. So that's an opportunity to authentically engage and connect with individuals. So if there were some negative feelings about police, I don't think they are there. And I said to her, when we have events, I would like for her to come out. She doesn't have to share her story, but if she just wants to be a part of this village, she can. Next slide, please. This 215 initiative was one that I thought was a little creative. I wanted to change things up. So the PPD, as you all know, is comprised of sworn and non-sworn personnel. So one day my aide and I were out in the field and we were working and we made a stop and we saw a gentleman. He owns the 215 Flavors water ice truck. So I said, excuse me, sir. And he turned around and immediately he says, wait a minute. Okay, ma'am, I will give you my paperwork. And I said, oh my goodness, he thinks that I'm trying to conduct a vehicle investigation or a pedestrian investigation. I said, no, sir. I said, I'm not here to investigate you. My aide and I would like to purchase some water ice. So he says, oh, okay. So I decided at that moment, my aide and I, it would be a good idea for him to connect with police officers and dispatchers by coming to our police headquarters and giving some water ice to the officers and the dispatchers because we were overworked. And he agreed to it. So my unit provided the funding for the water ice, and he came out and he enjoyed the conversations with the officers and the dispatchers, and they see him around the city and they have a good relationship now. I know we also have a lady by the name of Miss Evelyn Samuel, Evie's Cleaning Supplies. She actually is in West Philadelphia, where we have a great deal of our homicides taking place. And so it was like 95 degrees outside, and she has a stand outside where she sells her cleaning supplies. And I said, Miss Evelyn, it's too hot for you to be out here. Why don't you come down to police headquarters and I'll have you come in the lobby, and it would be nice for you to sell your supplies to police officers and radio dispatchers because we have a staffing level. So since we have some staffing levels, a lot of officers and police dispatchers are working double shifts. They don't have time to go out and purchase these supplies, and they love the idea. They authentically connected with her, and she has called me since and said officers now come to West Philadelphia from downtown to support her business. And that's a way to also just build authentic relationships with community members. Next slide, please. This initiative here, the 215 Villages, based upon restorative justice efforts. So that's working with rehabilitated offenders through reconciliation with victims and the community. I can tell you that I had a community meeting that I attended, and I met this executive director by the name of Miss Asada Thomas from the Institute for Community Justice, which is a reentry organization. And she asked me if I would be willing to go to SCI Phoenix Prison, which is a maximum prison predominantly for men. And she asked me would I go to that prison and speak with an organization, a group called Man Up. And Man Up is a peer-to-peer group. And I said, absolutely, I will go. So I went several times with the assistance of Judge Stephanie Sawyer, who you see in the picture to the far right, and her aide, Bree, to the far left. We went to this initiative. This was an opportunity for, I thought, law enforcement, as well as other organizations and entities to come and assist with reentry efforts. Law enforcement and victim service providers want to assist and ensure victims do not have reoccurrences of being victimized. So therefore, sometimes we are the voice for those victims to be able to interface with these men who are incarcerated for their indiscretions, if you will, so, or crimes. So also law enforcement works with the Man Up program to help decrease recidivism. And we also provide them with information. So we also provide them with information about criminal registration. And I think the most ironic thing about this initiative is seeing individuals who are not lifers, but who have spent time in prison, leave the prison and come to do criminal registration and say, excuse me, ma'am, don't I know you? And you came to the Man Up sessions, and when they come to get their criminal registration, they are provided with this list of 70 or so resources that are either free of charge or low cost to them. This is another way to authentically engage with individuals, to have them change their mindset and their behaviors towards police, as well as maybe even victim service providers, as well as maybe even their thought process about re-victimizing others. So next slide, please. The 215 Village Initiative, criminal justice partnerships. I think this is imperative that we all work together. I work with Judge Sawyer and her aide, and I've provided them with the resources that I've had for their offenders and offenders' family members, as well as Ms. Thomas works with all of us in this collaborative process. So ICJ, Institute for Community Justice, has programs and classes free of charge for GED assessments, for parenting classes. They also help to transition Man Up personnel from the prison back to the community by providing peer support, as well as anger management and yoga classes and financial literacy courses, all free of charge. Next slide, please. This event or initiative was actually a few days ago on October 20th. One of the collaborative teams in the 215 Village of the PPD is an organization called SELF. Mike Henson and his team. Mr. Henson contacted me and told me that one of his former clients, Mr. Lester Ross, died 5 months ago, and that he was left in the morgue unattended. He was unclaimed, as if he were nobody. That really bothered me, and it bothered Mike Henson as well. So Mike Henson reached out to myself, the Office of Homeless Services, One Day at a Time, that's ODAT, and the Department of Behavioral Health and Intellectual Disability Services, and we all decided to have a homeless service connect and resource event. In addition, at that event, we had a memorial service for Mr. Ross to make sure that he had some dignity in death. And from that moment on, myself and other participants provided a donation to start the Lester Ross Memorial Fund, so that all individuals in Philadelphia who die, who are homeless, and per se may not have family or resources to have a proper burial, we will make sure that they have a proper burial in terms of cremation, and ensure that they have dignity in death. So overall, I can tell you that this was an all hands on deck approach to ensure that solutions to the problems are taken care of. Overall, the 215 Village concept and model serves as a concrete way to connect with all persons in the community, and that the lines of communication can be open amongst individuals, groups, and or organizations just through certain initiatives. Next slide, please. Evaluation of efforts and outcomes, very important. Most people want to do the work or enjoy doing the work, but also you have to evaluate what's being done, these efforts. So I do have an anonymous survey whenever the 215 Village via the PPD Organizational Services Special Projects Unit has a, if we're at the forefront or maybe even the other initiatives, we do have an anonymous survey, which I have a copy of it here, as you can see, and participants share their thoughts and suggestions. This documented feedback helps to provide us with the needs of the community, the needs of victims, and the needs of anyone in the community on whom we serve. So we share these findings with the collaborative team, and if there's a suggestion about another initiative or another event or information session, whomever has the expertise, we get that individual as a subject matter expert to be the lead organization, and the collaborative team comes together to help that individual with the event so that they're not burned out or given all the responsibilities and tasks to do this on their own. And also with the surveys, there are some people, if they're having issues with literacy, we actually help take the information via an oral account, and we write the information down if need be to actually get their input as well. Next slide, please. I use the acronym of the word collaborate as an acronym, and I think it will help you understand about this whole process. So all work and collaborations between law enforcement, victim service providers, and others should always be of a substantive nature and not performative. So I use this acronym to describe how this process works and things you need to be cognizant of. So number one, C, collectively work together. When you're working together, getting to know one another, this gives you an opportunity to have the time to build on trust. O, organize to prevent chaos. We often don't do things at the last minute. If we do, we have a game plan in place. L, you have to lead with commitment. So the commitment is commit to change. If things are bad, we want to make them good. If things are good, we want to make them better. If things are better, we want to make them as best as possible. So L, lift others when they feel low or down. That's a good way to think and to get people to change their thought processes about law enforcement, as well as sometimes victim service providers and others. Also, A, assist to avoid overload. The reason why this collaborative team works so well that I'm working in now is because no one's overloaded with all of the work. B, you have to be authentic. There may be some things that you don't totally agree with. There may be times and initiatives that you don't want to do, but you still have to think of the team overall, and you have to think of the what and not the who, although there are exceptions to the rule. But it's nice to be authentic and be able to speak freely and know that your voice is heard and that everyone's input does matter. O, optimize resources. You want to make the best of the resources that you currently have and try and streamline the processes when necessary. R, you need to respect the people in this process because it is timely, it is arduous, but we are relentless in the work that we're doing. Also, A, avoid burnout because you can work so much to the point where you burn out. So we also often check on one another in these collaborative teams to make sure everyone's okay. T, trust people in the process. And E, everyone can help. There are times I thought when I had the first event with the health and wealth, we had a group come in from a homeless shelter. And I was touched when I had a few of the ladies say to me, what can I do to help? How can I help? And I'm like, you can have this. I don't have much to offer, or I don't have anything to offer. I said, sometimes you can just offer the truth of your own testimony, and that may help someone else to recognize that they're not alone. So whether it's donating some of your truth, your time, your talent, your treasure, that's all useful and necessary within the village. Next slide, please. So my closing remarks. I believe that the will to work together, let me start that over. The will to work together is the way to win. That's what I believe. And I've been believing that for many, many years. In particular, on the police department, I've found that I've had some amazing partners. I've worked with some amazing officers and supervisors and some commanders, great leadership at times. And I find that when we all work together, everything's a lot better. 2, we need to shift from having this fixed mindset to we want to work by ourselves. We want to be horizontal. We want to be this hierarchy. And the hierarchy is necessary only when it's necessary. So one of the things about this collaborative governance process, why it works so well, is that when police are working with these organizations, we don't come in with the mindset of working from a hierarchical relationship. We work with each other from a horizontal relationship that everyone has a fair say. So you have to have this growth mindset that you want to do better and you want to make changes. So you may have to do some changing with how you operate. 3, the collaboration process. As I said, it's not one overnight. It's not an overnight process. It's one of longevity. And also whether you have a small or large department, police department, that while I'm giving you broad information, it can be broad information, there are specifics that can be done, that can be tailored to your organization to actually establish a wonderful collaborative governance team, if you will. So law enforcement, meaning your victim services unit, your community relations, and your patrol officers should team up with victim service providers for community outreach. Given this day and age with the issues that are occurring in, say, my city in Philadelphia, should be on a weekly basis. And with these community outreach initiatives to build that collaboration, that collaborative governance team, you should follow up and follow through with the victims as well as with the services that are provided to them. I believe that leadership should be supportive and provide you as best as possible with the resources that are needed. And the beauty of it is your leader may be supportive, but may not have all the resources that you need. And that's okay, because guess what? I found that the individual organizations or other service providers often will provide those resources for you when you're trying to serve a victim or just the community at large. Also, number 7, I would say the start of the collaboration process. When you start this collaboration process, it should start within your police department first. And the reason being is because I believe that people on the outside can sense when there are some issues on the inside. So if you have this collaborative process beginning on the inside, where you're making these daily concerted efforts to speak with others whom you know, don't know, and let them know that you're there to support them. I had a conversation the other day with 2 homicide detectives, and I didn't know them, and I don't think they knew me. And we just had a conversation, and we chatted, and one of the detectives said to the other detective, you're gonna take the elevator? He was like, I'm enjoying talking to her, let's talk. So I thought that was cool because we didn't know one another, but now I have a sense of knowing these 2 detectives who probably have been on the job for several years. I just did not know them. So I think you should start with your department to work on that collaboration internally first, so that you can kind of fortify your strength in being able to work with others. Also, the exhibition of internal collaborations will show communities that you serve that you are as one. As I said earlier, I think that if you are willing to criticize, you have to be willing to correct. Also, no disrespect to anyone, I think that in law enforcement, as well as victim service provider agencies or any entities, whether you are the leader as an officer or a leader as a staff member or a leader as management, that you should not just be able to cry, or you shouldn't be crying about an issue or problems without wanting to correct them. And I think that's been a major source of contention for people throughout the US, with people not wanting to work on the issues that they're having, as opposed to just not correcting the issues, but maybe, and I hate to say the word cry, but that's the best word I can come up with right now, crying about the issues. So in closing, I feel like I've provided you with at least a broad framework and steps to developing a collaborative team. I can tell you it's you may contact me. I have my contact information and what you have right now. So I thank you for your time and opportunity. And I want to say I love Philadelphia. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie.
You're welcome.